Good evening and welcome to tonight's episode of Hot Topics. And so as many of you guys would have been following, we've been focusing on the church through this My Church, Your Church series. And today we're going to be looking at something that was said by Martin Luther King in 1970 when he said, church hour is the most segregated hour of the week. And where he was actually coming from is the fact that kids go to school together, people go to work together, people of different skin colors go to the same gym, people of different cultures go to the same gym, and all of that. But when it comes to Sunday hour, we all retreat to our own spaces. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. And to help us, where my Ilse and I are going to be engaging with the panel today, we've got in studio Faith Witby, who is the first female bishop of the Central District. We've got Xhanti Mhlubulwane, who is the lay president, but not only that in the district, but also the Black Methodist Consultation secretary. And then we've got Paul Varyn, who is a veteran and a bishop, former bishop of the Central District, but still involved in various spaces of the church. I, however, will hand over to you just to introduce yourself and tell us something in relation to the topic about yourself.
So good evening, everybody. My name is Faith Witby, as Xhanti has said. I am a Methodist minister stationed in Johannesburg. I'm the bishop-elect for the Central District. And I don't know that I have any expertise in the topic. But in terms of my experience as a minister, I have always been stationed in what the church calls a cross-cultural station. And so that has been an interesting experience for me. And for most of the more than 20 years that I've served as a minister, I have always been the first woman minister to be appointed to that particular context. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I am Xhanti Mhlubulwane, currently serving as a synod lay leader, not lay president. Lay president refers to the connectional lay president. And the topic at hand is very interesting and very challenging in many respects, because the Methodist Church back in 1958 declared itself as one and undivided church. So in many respects, if you look around, segregation remains within the life of our church everywhere you go. But I must also say, I think there is something about our faith that makes us retreat to who we are. Thank you.
And I'm Paul Varyn, and I'm retired and busier now than I ever have been before. And I was the first minister that was appointed in a white minister that was appointed after many centuries into a black context in Orlando, Soweto. It was then part of the Jabavu circuit. It is now a circuit by itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And so as we kick off tonight, just a couple of interesting facts that we gathered while we were preparing. One, more than 80% of South Africa would identify as Christian when asked, are you a Christian or not? But also, even more people, when you look at the Christian group within South Africa, you find that we've got a lot of denomination. But we not only split or divided across denominations, but even within our denominations, you've got people who would prefer to go to specific congregations simply because they feel that that's where they belong. I did a little Facebook exercise where I asked people on my Facebook list, why do you prefer to go to a particular church? And they said, if anything, it's more about belonging. But then the challenge then comes in to say, when we retreat to the spaces where we feel like we belong, does it allow us to engage in issues of integration and issues that are faced by South Africa in a faith space?
Absolutely. And I think I actually saw your Facebook post, and reading through some of the comments, it was interesting how people also brought up the fact about the different styles of worship that are associated with each of the different contexts, and how it at times can seem incompatible with us. It doesn't resonate with our culture or our upbringing. And it, again, comes back to the question of how do we unite as different cultures and different expressions of worship, if we even are called to unite and be one and undivided in the purest sense of the word.
And so what we really want to first throw out at the panel today is there's a radical statement that Martin Luther King Jr. makes, and he says, anyone that works against integration is working against the Spirit of God. how then do we reconcile that with the existence of exclusive spaces? Anyone who'd love to kick on that?
Well, to a large extent, it is true. We are working against integration because the church is a microcosm of the society. The segregation you see in church, to a large extent, it is the segregation that remains in our communities. And as the church, instead of modeling what society should be, in other words, through the discernment, collective discernment of the Holy Spirit, in terms of providing alternative models of new communities, we tend to copy and do what society is doing. And just lastly, unlike workplaces and schools, as an example, that have laws, employment equity, basic conditions of employment act and all of that, we don't have that in religion. It is a voluntary association. You become a member voluntarily. You don't have law that says thou shalt, thou shalt. And so this integration cannot be forced. People must see the need for integration and indeed through the collective discernment of the Holy Spirit, so that we don't work against the Holy Spirit.
I love that so much. I don't know, are there any other thoughts?
Just a slightly a different perspective. And while I would agree with Xhanti that we don't have laws as such in terms of how the church operates, I do think if we're talking about the discernment of the Holy Spirit, that is foundational to who we are as Christians. And so when Jesus prays that we would all be one in John 17, that I think needs to be held as a law. If we take Jesus seriously, then we will begin to find ways in which we can be quite intentional, because I think the word that will help us here is intentionality, quite intentional about finding different models. So in my personal experience, and this was not as a church member, this was when I became a minister, the church was very intentional about stationing ministers cross-culturally. So whether or not you understood the language or the culture or the style of worship, as a minister who says, I will go where I'm sent, you would be stationed in a context different to the one with which you were familiar. And it was that intentionality which I think helped to set the tone for my own personal growth, but I think is also something that we need to incorporate into our understanding of what Jesus prays and how we take that then into our life together.
Maybe to come at it from a different space and to say we've got to look for the fine balance between our identity and a sense of belonging and the fact that we're not always in step with the Spirit, which makes you uncomfortable intentionally. So, for instance, what we've learned from the history of this country is that we have to be particularly careful as church people of getting into a group of people that are all the same as we are in this country. Because there was a time in our history, from about 1948, where there was a development under the guise of the Spirit of a doctrine of separation. And in actual fact, the separation became a political strategy and law in the country. So there was a time in this country where it was illegal, and fairly recently, for a white to be in a black area. And then I don't have to tell you the rest of the manipulation of the politics of the country, which justified all sorts of treacherous behavior, until ultimately, apartheid had to be declared by the church internationally as a sin. So we've got to balance those two things. It might be very comfortable for me to be in my safe space as a white, but I have got to be very, very careful that that safe space doesn't engender racism and seeing other people as less than human beings.
Absolutely, thank you. I want to pick up on something that you said, Faith, about intentionality. Now, I did a little bit of research around this topic just to get a bit of the aspect of tradition. And I found a statement or a bit of it, something about the Methodist Church about our mission statement. And if you don't mind, I would like to read it out. So what this article spoke about was the mission statement of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa is God calls the Methodist people to proclaim its gospel of Jesus Christ for healing and transformation. Its vision is a Christ-healed Africa for the healing of nations. The continuing goals of transformation are deepening spirituality, resolve to be guided by God's mission, a rediscovery of the priesthood of all believers, a commitment to be one so that the world may believe, a re-emphasis of servant leadership and discernment as our model for ministry, a redefinition and authentication of the vocation of the clergy in the church. The ideal of one and undivided church still has to be realized at a congregational level. Do you find within your own congregations and context that you pastor that there is a huge continuing gap in what the ideal is, even though these statements have been around for years? Actually, it's become part of our tradition as a church. Do you find that what is the ideal and what we seek to achieve continues to remain a challenge? And what maybe as a double question is, what are some initiatives that you found useful in starting to move us towards the ideal, what we've put together as the Methodist Church of what we'd like to see? Just for anyone who'd like to start.
Well, the truth of the matter is that those statements are part of the journey to the new land and the transformation calls that we believe as Methodists is theory versus practice, orthodox versus praxis. And so it is important to note that one of the things we used to do and to be known for as the Methodist Church is teaching. Through cell groups, through small groups, through classes. And that's part of Methodist tradition that we have not upheld. Over the years, teaching has been replaced by the pressure, I would call it, from prosperity ministry and aggressive evangelism in communities where Methodist churches exist. And so in response to that, you will find that local ministers, resident ministers, instead of seeking how best do we live out those values, how best do we live out the spirit of discernment, being led by the Spirit, how best do we become one and implement so that every member understands this, we tend to react to competition, to members who are living for the nearest a mushrooming prosperity church around the corner that is promising everything without discipleship. There is a cost to discipleship, and prosperity ministry does not preach that. It preaches that you can sleep today with a minus in your bank, you wake up tomorrow with 100,000. And that's what it preaches. So our local congregations, instead of responding to those calls and how best do we become missionary congregations, incarnational mission, how do we live out in practice and become one with the community, they tend to neglect that. That's my experience and observation.
Thanks, Ilse. It's an interesting question. And I think for me as a minister in a local church, particularly my previous context and my current one, where on the surface there is the appearance of integration, but in reality there are still deep divisions. Part of the challenge there relates, as Paul has mentioned, to our history as South Africans. And so the geography of apartheid still lives with us. And when you are in a suburban, what is called in South Africa, a suburban context, integration within the church often looks like a shift in demographics in terms of membership as the community around the church changes. Then I think there are opportunities to begin the conversation. To begin the conversation in your leadership as a local minister around what does, and we need to think about the language we use. Are we talking inclusion? Because inclusion for me carries within it dynamics of power. Who includes? Who makes the decision about who is included and who is not? Are we talking integration? What does that mean? And I think each conversation will be different depending on the context within which you're located. So within leadership, within the teaching, certainly of cell groups, class meetings, Bible study groups, and there for me, Scripture is always helpful as a place to begin to open up our thinking about how we relate to one another. And then simply being a different presence in a community, a different skin color, a different language speaker. And so one of the gifts for me as a minister is I have been placed intentionally by the church as a minister in a context where I'm the only English speaker. And really my language doesn't matter then. And because that's not the language in which worship is conducted, that's not the language in which meetings are conducted. And so part of the challenge is, I think, for those of us who are first language English speakers, is to live with that discomfort, to be prepared to say, I don't know, I have no clue, I don't, even though I'm supposed to lead. I might be the steward, I might be the minister. And so for me, it's a journey, it's a process, it's a conversation, it's work that needs to happen. And that happens when you build relationships in community.
I want to begin where Xhanti hinted. The Methodist Church down the centuries in this country has been involved in education. It's been a central piece of education. And as we try and become one, central to that has been an avoidance of what do we have to learn from one another. There is a colonial mindset that is still very present in Methodism, which makes English and white custom right. And all the rest is kind of a second-class affair. And I've mentioned on this program before that my journey into Orlando was a revolution, first of all, to me, of what church was about and how people did church. And that church was not as divorced from people's lives as the culture that I come from, which was an hour on a Sunday, a hymn and a thing, and very structured, very organized, which of course appeals to, control, if you want it that way. Then I got into this, what seemed to me a very untidy way of worship, you understand, where the notices, and what's so important about notices? Notices could take an hour. And notices could ramble on to all sorts of nonsense, you understand? And on and on and on. And the church service often lasted without a wink for 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours. Now, you must understand, for a very important and a very busy person, this is a hang of a waste of time. And I'm now in a context where, what do you mean this is a waste of time? This is God's time, which reconstructed my whole understanding of actually making God an agenda item. So you must understand. And I didn't come into the church as a nincompoop and didn't understand that God was supposed to be your be-all and end-all, but the actual living of that. And then discovered that in actual fact, that community gathering was in actual fact a very important part of framing the society. And you walked out of that church and you clearly understood that that was not actually the end of church. There were all these classes, and the classes, when they worked very well, asked two questions. The first question was, how is it with your soul? How is it with your soul? And secondly, what are you doing to further your relationship with Christ in terms of becoming holy, as it were? Now let me give you an interesting piece of history. And that is that you can imagine being a miner in England in the 18th century. How is it with your soul? Well, let me tell you how it is with my soul. I hate my job. It's the only way in which I can get money to put food on the table. I feel as if the mining industry is a place of profound injustice and inequity. So you're either born with a silver spoon in your mouth and you're the manager, or you're just a piece of rubbish that works down a hole. And I hate it. So that's how it is with your soul. Yes, and how is it with your soul? No, he said everything. I just like to add a little bit more. I never know when I say goodbye to my family in the morning whether I'm going to be alive or dead by the evening. But we can't then, in this class meeting, leave hearing these things week by week and do nothing about it. So let's organize ourselves. And what happened? The first trade union was born in a class meeting in the Methodist Church. You with me? And there are historians that will argue with you and say that if the trade union movement did not come into Britain at the time that it did, Britain would have faced a revolution similar to what happened in France, where many, many people were butchered to death. And so the Methodist Church carries quite a legacy of interfering with the status quo. Now let me just give you just a half a second. Most of the people that come into the Methodist Church don't realize that 20 million people go to bed hungry every night in South Africa. And it is impossible for you to read the Gospels and think that Jesus didn't bother about feeding people. Am I making sense? And so, how do we mobilize? How do we basically mobilize so that no one goes hungry in this country at night? And it takes a very, very specific kind of integration of our prayers, and you spoke about the discernment of the Spirit. And a discernment of the Spirit as to how. We don't have a revolution in this country because if we don't act swiftly, we will.
Sure. Thank you so much to everyone. And I just want to pick up from where Paul has left and maybe just kicking us forward. So one of the challenges we have in the Methodist Church is the constant migration that you find in suburbs. You find that if Hloni, for instance, who lives in Lone Hill, is looking for a Methodist church, I would most likely go to Diepsloot because I feel like I belong in that particular space. Or you find that in some of our congregations, most of our old white churches, or old suburb churches, perhaps that's the correct phrase for now, will have a lot of services in order to cater for people's different preferences. Now, I want to bring into mind characters like Alpheus Zulu, Bishop Alpheus Zulu of the Anglican Church, who would have been someone who was pro-IFP, pro-ANC, but at the very same time acknowledges the importance of being able to organize yourself across racial lines in order to work against what is happening. So, existing in our exclusive spaces, how do we continue with what has been modeled by people like Bishop Alpheus Zulu, where we are able to organize ourselves when we are in exclusive spaces? Does that work against the ability to organize ourselves against what is happening in South Africa? Or are we most likely able to organize ourselves towards saying, let us engage the inequalities of South Africa when we're all in the same space? Poor people, rich people, people of different belongings and cultural backgrounds.
Well, to a large extent, the status quo incapacitates our ability to organize our response as a collective, in that indeed we are all in different spaces exclusively. And some of the examples you are painting, you could find that even though Bryanston Methodist Church, as an example, is trying to cater for all these different groups of people, you end up having some kind of a schism where it seems you have 2 or 3 congregations in one. And so, in terms of our ability to organize ourselves against the isms of the society, poverty and the likes, we possibly can do it at a circuit level and not at a local level where it is needed. And we have always learned in the church from our forebears, like Bishop Paul here, that mission is local. And so being local means within the local organization, the local congregation, you must be able to organize your response. And perhaps my last input is that what sustains our segregation is our mental images of what it means to be church. We carry that with us. If I'm from Tuba or from Batawat Segregated 2 as I am, I carry that mental image of what it means to be church with me, to a point where even if you are a resident in Morningside, Sandton, you would look for a church that matches the mental image of what it means to be church to you. But then you need circuit leadership to bring together, to say, in 4 ways, circuit, these are the challenges, these are the inequalities. Look at Alexandra, look at Sandton, look at Diepsloot, look at 4 ways. And therefore, missionary, how do we respond as a circuit, not more as a local congregation? Because our exclusive, our segregation sustains the status quo, and it definitely incapacitates us to a large extent.
I think I would engage with what you're raising from a slightly different perspective. I've worked in the inner city as a minister. I've worked in suburban churches, but I grew up in a township. And one of the advantages for me, now looking back as a minister and thinking about how community was shaped in that context, is the fact that although worship happens in a racially segregated way there are other places of connection and relationship and community building, and one of them is ecumenically. So with other churches, so I think of the township in which I grew up, where within the space of not even 2 kilometers, you've got a Methodist church, you've got an Anglican church, you've got a Roman Catholic church. There was at one point, I don't know if it still runs, an Evangelical Lutheran church, and those are just the established churches. You also then have an interfaith option because you have a strong Muslim community in many of our townships. And so simply from that basis, although still racially segregated, largely, there are opportunities for connecting, for relationship building, for strategizing and thinking about how do we deal with the fact that drug use is such a huge problem in this community, or unemployment is such a challenge, or food security. How do we, as churches and we can literally walk from one to the other, how do we connect and begin to look for a different way of being that addresses huge issues that affect us here and now locally, but also affect the broader community of which we are a part? And so yes, we are hampered to an extent in certain contexts by our separation, but in other contexts, there are other ways of connecting and building relationships.
Faith has triggered a thought for me of two contexts that I've had an opportunity to work in. The one is in Kulini, and you'll remember in Kulini there was a young man of 16 who ultimately ended up dead because he stole a sunflower. And so I eventually ended up in the township of Tlabolugang, which is the township of Kulini. And we began to mobilize there. Now, the interesting thing about the township is that the main road into the township really has one church next to another church, next to another church, next to another church. And so we've met in the Methodist Church. We primarily prefer to meet in the Anglican Church because it's bigger. And we've also met in the Lutheran Church. And they literally are, as Faith says, right next to one another. Now, one of your biggest problems in Tlabolugang is the unemployment of young people between the age of 17, let's say 17 and 25. And there is almost no capacity for these young people. They're unemployed, they're not in an education situation, and what do? What do they do with their day? They get up to nonsense. And they cause havoc for the elders in the community. The other place is a place in KwaZulu-Natal. Just to get to the church we met in, which was the Congregational Church, was hazardous along the road. There were times when we were driving along the road and you wondered if the car just tipped a little bit, would you roll down to the bottom? But the one institution in that place was that there were several churches, not as close as in Kulini. And they brought into the problem of that community the young people. Not so much that the young people were disobedient, but two things. They felt that their young men particularly did not respect women. And the reason for that was that they hadn't been able to go through a transition from childhood into manhood. And then, of course, also the skills. Now, can you imagine setting up something like this? You set up a system where you offer certain skills development opportunities. Skills which very specifically relate to what looks like it could become the economy of that place. Whether it's agriculture, whether it is training people in technical building skills. So you'll go to, let's say, the Congregational Church, and you'll set up an agriculture hub. Then you'll go to the Methodist Church, and there all the men of the community, the older, respected men, will spend time with the younger men, helping them understand their responsibility as adult men in terms of their respect and their care of children and their community, and particularly teaching them about what's cursing us at the moment, which is this dreadful gender-based violence thing. And the same could happen. I was phoned on a Sunday afternoon by the leader of the community in Kulini who said to me, we've got a little girl of 5 that has been raped by a little boy of 10. And we've tried to go to the police station and we have got nowhere. And we're terribly worried that the little girl has been hurt. So because of the work that we've been doing there, because of this tragedy of this young man, I phoned the Dutch Reformed Dominee. He got into his bakkie, he went straight into the township, fetched the little girl and took her to a hospital, a competent hospital not far away. Soon after that, we had a meeting in the Methodist Church and we gathered all the parents, young parents of small children, and had a whole afternoon of training in terms of parenthood, in terms of teaching young children about sex, and on and on. And so what you say really leads me to say we have no idea that if we took the unity of the church in Methodism, the unity of the church in terms of colored, Indian, black, white, we have no idea of the capacity that we will unleash in this country in transforming the entire racist narrative that we're struggling with still. And then you can imagine the church has always been a place of education. What we could do if we put our hands together with Anglicans and Muslims and Catholics and the rest. But then one has to recognize that sitting in your congregation are not just people who have no capacity and who are stupid and who are really just there to sit and listen. There, our class meetings can begin to be mobilized. And we've got the structure in the Methodist Church, particularly in the Black Methodist Church, that operates like clockwork and with efficiency every Sunday.
Sure. Thank you. And I think just before we then close it off, I'll throw in a statement that you can answer in 2 seconds, 2 minutes, but just really briefly, is that, there is the need for integration. We definitely need it, without a doubt. But read an exciting article written by one of our ministers, namely Ndiko Mchiselwa, in celebrating the existence of the Black Methodist Consultation. And what he cites as one of the reasons, or rather 2 of the reasons that we still need an exclusive black space, is that we still need to engage in equality in the church. He says that is still an important reason, but also we need to eradicate the traits of colonialism that still exist in the church. He makes examples of hymn 245 in Xhosa, which says "Dikhokele," which is a very un-African thing to say, "Guide me." It would rather be "guide us," And so there are these values that are being forced down people's throats, and so you need an exclusive space where you're going to engage those things without feeling inferior, without feeling as though there's a louder voice in the house. So how do we then, before Ilse wraps it up for us in 2 seconds from everyone, how do we then continue to engage the need of integration, but holding it with attention of the other spaces that we need, like spaces that will continue to engage on issues such as why on earth does the Xhosa hymn book still start by demonizing black people and saying when the heathen, why do we still have those issues? Now, how do we hold those 2 tensions?
We certainly need to identify areas that need to be changed. That's important. And we take necessary resolutions to change that. Surely there's something wrong with our hymn book still referring to Kumkani Kazu Elizabeth centuries later, and as if it is printed in Britain when it is printed here in South Africa. So we really have not done what we ought to have done. And so part of working towards integration is to admit we should have done this, we didn't do it, who is going to do it when, and there's some kind of accountability. 2, and lastly, I agree we still need some of the exclusive spaces to reflect on what it means to be black and the damage that has been caused by colonialism and apartheid. What damage has it caused? Without any interference from someone else to interpret my experience. We need to experience what that means and interpret what that means for us and what solutions can we seek together. In my view, these can coexist without tension. There must be transparency. If I'm going to a Black Methodist consultation, my superintendent always knows that I'm going to this meeting. And if he wants the agenda, I can share the agenda. And that's it. There is transparency. But at the same time, there is freedom in me reflecting on what I believe is important for us to look at. So we've got to work towards integration. There's power in humanism, interfaith, and we increase social action so that we are more visible in the community than we are visible in the sanctuary. The community pulpit must take a higher place in our priority list than the sanctuary pulpit. Thank you.
Just very briefly from me, I think the word tension is helpful. And I do think we need spaces of challenge and engagement with one another, but also spaces of reflection and being able to speak in a voice that is heard, that is recognized, and how we manage that is an ongoing journey. The one doesn't necessarily exclude the other. We might, at this stage in our history, need both those spaces as we journey towards a deeper understanding of what it means to be one in Christ.
So I do believe that the BMC, as it's abbreviated, is a gift to the church. But let me just say, I suppose this comes from my memory. The Broederbond, which eventually became a very, very potent weapon in the whole racist journey, and we've got to recognize that, actually came from Afrikaners deciding that they wanted to group together against British colonialism. And ultimately it became a vicious instrument of assertion. And so I suppose two things. There is a challenge to the BMC that it, at the back of its mind, has got to keep very carefully in check that power in all of our hands is a very, very tricky gift that can ultimately build or destroy. And so the Afrikaner got their identity all sorted out, and their ultimate target was not decolonization. Their ultimate target became the black community. And they eventually became the victims of a most outrageous victimization. And one has to be careful that can happen. Just as it happened with whites a long time ago. But the second thing, I want to give a challenge to the BMC. And the challenge to the BMC is that there is an enormous educational task that needs to take place, primarily from black to white. Many whites don't see themselves as ignorant, and they are ignorant. They actually do not understand the profound nuance of the cultures of black people. And black people need to stand up and say, these are the things I learn in my culture. And the values that come from essentially being black. Not the old hackneyed Ubuntu and Gumuntu and Gabantu thing. We know all about that. But there are some very, very specific teachings, very specific, that we need to learn from one another. And it would be very wonderful, I think, if the Black Methodist Consultation targeted as part of their education program whites and coloreds, with respect, and Indians in the church, so that when we talk about becoming one, it's not just that we have a fancy way of singing and shaking in church together, but there is a very deep understanding and respect of one another. And when you talk about a community pulpit, I mean, that begins to start opening up the imagination of how you begin to start spreading the word in a new way.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to everyone here, but also to those that have joined us from home. I think there's one thing that my sense is leaving this is that it is an unfinished conversation. That within our homes, within our communities, within our churches, within each exclusive group that we find ourselves a part of, this conversation must continue. And it is in that way that we do find ourselves moving towards being one and undivided church. And so I just want to encourage everyone at home to join us on Tuesday night as we unpack this a little bit further as part of our Tuesday night chats at 7 p.m. on Zoom. The details will follow quite soon, but I'd like to encourage you to join us as we see where do we come up with these ideas and how do we understand this a little bit more contextually, but also practically within our own spaces. And so please do join us for that. We wish you a blessed evening and a wonderful week further.